the corporation soul dealing with the portfolio of state enterprise assets, and also the Minister of Energy, who has the responsibility specifically for Petrotrin and its subsidiaries. I have called you here this afternoon at such short notice to acknowledge and to condemn the irresponsible conduct of the opposition leader in Trinidad and Tobago. The opposition leader in Trinidad and Tobago has a difficult job. I know it, I've been there. And one simply has to be observing to know that some people handle things differently. Our current opposition leader needs to make herself relevant, but certainly it ought not to be at the expense of the national community. They have a habit of trying to upstage the government on representation of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So whenever it is required for the government to represent the people, the opposition leader tends to want to jump out in front, either to make a statement or to ask questions or to congratulate, when in fact these things are really the preserve of the government representing the people. As a result of that, we've seen the opposition leader from time to time doing very unethical things. During the COVID early days, we had an opposition that was quite dismissive of the government's effort and concern in dealing with COVID. Eventually, of course, the WHO put out a calendar of COVID concerns, and it was a very impressive piece of work coming from WHO to those of us in the world who are paying attention to the management of COVID issues. The UNC opposition plagiarized the calendar, put the name of the opposition leader and a picture on it, and put it out as though it was a UNC piece of work. That was not the end of it. We were talking and responding to the arrival of the virus here in Trinidad and Tobago, and eventually, as we all expected, eventually we will face death, as the rest of the world was. And you may recall the disgusting conduct of the opposition leader, who, when we had our first COVID death, breached all hospital protocols and Ministry of Health standing protocols about bereavement, and ran out as opposition leader and made a political announcement of the death of the first person from COVID in Trinidad and Tobago. You may recall that. It was quite upsetting to the family, to the community, and to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But last Saturday, they went one better. And the background of it is this. Trinidad and Tobago has a foreign policy, which is being run by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And some countries would say in their own language that politics stops at the border, but not in Trinidad and Tobago. What we faced for the last year and a half or 2 years was an opposition led by Mrs. Kamla Persad-Bissessar, followed by Rodney Charles and others, who were actively undermining the foreign policy of Trinidad and Tobago. There were some U.S. activities and policies that affect the Caribbean and Venezuela in particular, which were not in sync with Trinidad and Tobago's principles and our foreign policy as practiced by this nation. And as fast as the government stood its position in the face of the Donald Trump regime's activities in and around the region, the opposition in Trinidad and Tobago relentlessly undermined the government's effort, openly supporting some President Guaido in Venezuela, asking for sanctions against Trinidad and Tobago, fabricating stories about Paria, a state company trading in fuel in violation of U.S. sanctions, writing the ambassador of the United States asking him to take action against members of the government and the country. That was the opposition. Lo and behold, last Saturday there was an election result in Washington. And against that background, and in the keeping of their practice of running ahead and trying to upstage the government, while we were in this room doing our weekly COVID update, the opposition leader issued a statement of congratulation to President-elect Joe Biden. Well, nothing wrong with that. Anybody can do that, and it's quite proper to do that and normal. Except that our opposition leader, in a simple matter, like saying congratulations to a foreign leader or anybody, disgraced our country by plagiarizing virtually word for word the congratulations of a British member of Parliament who had posted his congratulations a few hours earlier on Twitter. And of course, the explanations for that are themselves an embarrassment. As a result of that, which became the news on Saturday night, by Sunday, the opposition leader was in big trouble, humiliated by being discovered for this infraction. And of course, by Monday night, she needed a distraction. So she organized her forum on Monday and decided to interfere, intervene, undermine, lambaste, and destroy the government's carefully laid plans and carefully negotiated positions with respect to the Petrotrin refinery, Paria and Patriotic. By Tuesday, the editorial in The Guardian was, "Kamala must stand up and face the music." This is the editorial in The Guardian about the behavior of the leader of the opposition on a simple matter of saying congratulations to a leader, a foreign leader. And this was The Guardian talking, editorializing about the disgusting plagiarizing of what should have been a two-line congratulation. By this morning, or today is Wednesday, by this morning, the question to the public by The Guardian is, should opposition leader Kamala Persad-Bissessar accept personal responsibility for the plagiarized congratulatory message to US President-elect Joe Biden? So the opposition leader was in deep, deep doo-doo over that bit of dishonesty. So she found her way out of that by looking, as she says, in her mailbox and found a document which she is happy to bring to the public to enlighten the public and to elucidate for the public something that she has discovered that the government was doing in secret and which the population has to rely on her to expose. And what was it? It was the document that was put from the negotiating team at Patriotic to the government's team, including a position or positions in an ongoing negotiation in commercial matters, which carry with them certain non-disclosure agreements, because negotiations of this nature are for good reason done behind closed doors as positions move back and forth until you get to a point of agreement, and usually it is a give and take situation. But the biggest part of it is that the opposition leader is telling the country quite incorrectly that she has discovered something that the population did not know. And that something is that the government intends to sell assets from Petrotrin, namely Guaracaria, the subsidiary of Petrotrin, which is really the refinery. Well, ladies and gentlemen, anybody who was paying attention to the business of government in Trinidad and Tobago for the last 4 years would have known that this is no disclosure, it is no mark to bust, because I, as Prime Minister, and other members of the government, every step of the way has told the public what we were doing and why we were doing it. Let us back up to the closure of the refinery in late 2018. At the time when the government announced that the refinery was being closed and that we had restructured the company of Petrotrin, leaving Petrotrin as a holding company and creating under that holding company 3 subsidiaries, one of which was Heritage Petroleum, which has been doing quite well and successfully. The other one is Paria, which was meant to fill the gap of purchasing from abroad, importing into the country, supplying finished products, fuels like gasoline and diesel to the national community, because we were no longer producing that in a refinery that we had closed. So Paria came into being because we had closed the refinery, because the supply of fuel was an extended part of the refinery operation. So once we closed the refinery, we had to take steps to have fuel supplied to the country, and thus Paria was born, and Paria lives on that basis. You may recall when we did that, there was all this doom and gloom talk from the said opposition and the said opposition leader about what was going to happen to the fuel supply, what was going to happen to the price of fuel, how there were going to be all kinds of short. What happened? A very smooth, undisturbed transition of the supply of fuel. In fact, even before the fuel was supplied from Paria, even before we had imported the first shipment of fuel, the opposition was out there encouraging people to say that the new fuel burning out faster in their cars, even before we had put the fuel into the market. But that is their style. And of course, Guara Carrier was the company, the refinery. We told the nation that we would go out, and we did so. We went out for requests for proposals, called RFP, to the world, asking any person, any entity, any company who may be interested in a used refinery which is now not in operation in Trinidad and Tobago, to make proposals to the relevant authorities in Trinidad and Tobago. And that was done in the most transparent and open way, where all interested parties were given access to over time, and we had a data room and all of that, and when all that was done, they were allowed to put their proposals in. And the cabinet put in place an evaluation committee of very distinguished citizens to deal with those submissions, and from their work advise the cabinet which of these many proposals has the best prospect of success and which one has served the public interest best. That was done, all of it, in front of the public. So I don't know where the opposition leader is coming from now to try to surprise the country in her weekend of difficulty by telling the country that she has discovered that the government intends to sell the refinery. It was always the government's intention, and said so, that we asked for proposals. Some people wanted to buy it, some wanted to lease it, some wanted to use it for free, some didn't have any idea what it was about. So therefore, from the time you go out for requests for proposals, one of the proposals was an option to purchase it. That happens to be the proposal that the evaluating team said to the government is the best of all proposals. A proposal from a local company owned by OWTU was selected because their offer was deemed to be the best one, and they wanted to buy the refinery. So right then and there, the country would have known that the refinery was for sale and there was a buyer in the offing. And all of our dealings with Patriotic since then was against the background of an offer to purchase the refinery. So I don't know why the opposition leader believes that she can drag herself out of her dismal condition this weekend by surprising the country with news that she got in her mailbox. Maybe the same place she got Mr. English MP congratulations from. It came to her mailbox, and she got in her mailbox a document that says that the refinery is going to be sold. There's absolutely no news in that. It's an act of desperation. And of course, the government always maintained to Patriotic, to the company, and to the population that in this matter of the restructuring of Petrotrin, the government will protect the public interest, in this case, the whole question of this security for fuel supply to the country. And therein comes Paria. If the refinery is sold and the refinery is producing finished product like gasoline and diesel, what do they do with it? Do they compete with another company that the government owns here in Trinidad and Tobago, Paria, that is doing the same thing, importing it from abroad? Or do we negotiate a way where the refinery and Patriotic and Paria see this as a national effort, and refinery and imported and exporting of fuel is a business that you negotiate into? And these are the kinds of issues that attracted the attention of all parties behind closed doors. And that is why you need non-disclosure to protect positions as they evolve. And if, as you get to a situation where it appears as though it is going to go on forever with the negotiations and the back and forth, we have to have a deadline. That we have to come to an agreement. This is not new. In these kinds of negotiations and commercial transactions and takeovers and so, there's a deadline. You would have been told that the government had set a deadline so that the negotiating parties can try to complete it by the 31st of October. And that happened. By the 31st of October, Patriotic put what in effect was their response to the negotiating period to the government's team. The government very quickly looked at it and saw certain things in it which were unacceptable to the government, and very quickly responded saying, listen, this is not acceptable to us. So if the opposition leader finds a document, and in the document she can point to things that she thinks is unacceptable to her, then maybe she saw what the government saw. But to come and raise it as it is something that she's exposing that is detrimental, and had she not disgraced herself on Monday night with it, you wouldn't have known, is simply a question of conduct. The government did not agree to certain things in that final position from Patriotic, and they asked for more time. And of course, more time was granted. I presume that time would be used to refine their position, improve it, or to stand on certain situations. This is what goes on in commercial negotiations. It is not that anybody is hiding anything from it. The principles of what we are doing quite open and unknown. The refinery is for sale, on what terms and conditions, and the Minister of Finance will mention that in a little while, about adjustments in what is there. And of course, one person can't agree to a contract. It takes at least two people. So if the government doesn't agree to what Patriotic has put forward in the negotiations, well then that's the end of it. And if Patriotic cannot agree to what the government is demanding of a buyer, then so be it. But you get to the ridiculous, where accusations are being made while the negotiations with Patriotic are in this very sensitive stage. You have the opposition leader, who was a former prime minister, who is a senior counsel, pretending not to understand what I'm saying here, and throwing out questions to the government, implying that the government has some under-the-table, underhand arrangements being made. I mean, it's all well and good for columnists and other people to make those assumptions, but as opposition leader, a higher level of responsibility is required of you. Asking the government if we have a buyer on the side, and that we're using Patriotic for some nefarious or nebulous reason. The answer is no. We have nobody under the table, we have nobody under the bed, we have nobody on the side. What we said publicly, and I as head of the government, I said so, speaking for the government and the country. If we cannot come to an acceptable agreement with Patriotic on this matter, having been selected as the preferred bidder, we will end our relationship. The exclusivity which we gave them for the period of a year or two will end, and the government will go back out to the market to see if there is anybody else out there who at this time may make a proposal to us or proposals to us. In the same way we went out before, we go back out to the market. So while the government is saying that we are going to go back out to the market to see what is there, the opposition is asking questions as to whether we have somebody under the table. We have nobody under the table. That was your style. It is not the style of this government to do that. We have been open and transparent every step of the way. What you see is what you get. And to try to pretend that there's some issue about doing this without the proclamation of the procurement legislation is simply to have me ask her, when you were giving SIS that $1 billion contract down in the sea lots, which is now rusting in the bush there, you're so concerned about taxpayers' money and procurement legislation. What procurement legislation you had used to do that? And that was a simple, straightforward contract that would easily have fallen under the procurement legislation and the director in there. But this matter I'm talking about has to involve negotiations of government authority with a buyer. The Petrotrin leadership and the government evaluation teams, they have to negotiate. So procurement legislation or not, this is what the government has to do. So this pretense that something is happening outside of legislation is absolute tomfoolery. And coming from a former prime minister, it is getting to the point now of being annoying. But she's hoping that the population is sufficiently ignorant of these facts that you will believe that something is happening against your interests. The only thing that is happening against your interests here is the opposition leader now taking action to give life to what they promised during the election campaign. During the election campaign, this issue of the Petrotrin and subsidiary matter, patriotic, dealing with the government on the acquisition of the refinery, was a subject to the general election. The government said, we will work alongside patriotic to see whether we can come to an agreement, and once we come to an agreement, the government will effect it and allow patriotic to do what they want to do with respect to the offer at the bidding stage. The opposition led by Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bissessa was very clear that if they win the election, they will stop this process and they will not allow it to go through. That was their position. So the population had a clear difference of position. The PNM government is trying to get it done because we all know that if the refinery is restarted, it matters not who owns it. Once the refinery is restarted and brought back into business, that it will have benefits for the people around Pointe-à-Pitre, San Fernando, and the nation at large. We know that. But there are terms and conditions that have to be met that have to make sense. The government has said the taxpayer is not going to reopen that refinery. That's a clear position of policy. But if there's anybody else, then we will encourage them to do it because there are benefits to be had which the taxpayers cannot enter into. The reason being that one of the main reasons for the failure of the refinery as a business is the whole question of not having oil to refine in Trinidad and Tobago, not enough oil. So the refinery was being run largely on imported crude oil. Over 100,000 barrels per day had to be imported to be refined, and the refining process and operation was the money loser. So if we don't have that crude oil, which we don't have sufficiently, then there's no business to get back into to keep importing crude oil again to refine and lose money. But if there is somebody who has crude oil available and wants to use the refinery, the government will welcome them in some kind of transaction, which you'll have to negotiate yourself into. And that's where we are. So you hear the name mentioned, Trafigura, and all kind of conspiracy theories being drummed up by the opposition leader about Trafigura. Trafigura is not the government's partner. Trafigura comes with the patriotic offer because the OWTU, in wanting to get involved in refining, they went and looked for their partner, which I presume is a partner that will bring to them the raw material that the government didn't have. And that's a fundamental part of their offer, because if they don't have crude, and crude from a source that is useful to their bid, then they have no proposal. So the opposition leader is misleading the population by implying that the government has some deal to appear somewhere involving Trafigura. Trafigura is Patriotic's business. And to the extent that Patriotic is involved with Trafigura, it will come to the government's notice when the government asks certain questions as to show me your partner, show me your money, because if you have a used car to sell and somebody comes to buy it, and they tell you, well, I want to buy your used car, and give me the key, because I have a ticket in my pocket from national lotteries, and I intend to pay you when I win the lottery, you're not going to give them a used car. You would want to know that you're going to be paid for what you're going to pass on to them. And it's the same thing in this kind of commerce. And then to add insult to injury, in her expose on Monday night with what she got in her mailbox and in the disgrace that she's engaging in, she's going to tell the country that the government has been fooling the workers of OWTU and fooling the country because the government never intended to sell it to the OWTU and Patriotic because it cannot be sold because the asset is mortgaged. What dotishness. So if something is mortgaged, means that it cannot be sold. So all the houses in my neighborhood in Goodwood Park and in Belmont and in wherever you have houses in this country, where people have a mortgage on their house, please be advised by the opposition leader that you can't sell your house because you have a mortgage on it. Have you ever heard anything more ridiculous? If there is a mortgage on an asset and it has to be sold, It simply requires a change of the relationship between the seller and the mortgager, and you work out whatever you have to work out, and the sale takes place, and you determine what happens to the proceeds, and so on and so on. But to categorically come out as senior counsellor and opposition leader and former prime minister and tell this country that we have been engaged in fooling people and fooling the country because there's a mortgage, there's a lien on the assets, it either tells me that the opposition leader is a lot less than we think she is, or she's deliberately devious and destructive. Because what she has done by this behavior of coming to the public and seeking to tease out and tear apart this confidential document at a sensitive stage in negotiations between a state entity and a prospective buyer can only be regarded as very destructive, undermining conduct, hoping to destroy any prospect of success in this matter. And I want to repeat that. They promised to shut it down during the election campaign. They thought they were going to win the election. And they gave notice and statement that they will shut down this approach of patriotic getting these assets and attempting to restart the refinery. Having failed in the political arena, they now use the opposition arena to create this manima now to do two things. One, to scare bankers away from OWTU and patriotic. Because bankers are very skittish. The minute they hear that there is a to-in and fro-in in this kind of situation, bankers are very conservative. They're likely to say, listen, I don't think I want to get involved in this. Because if the opposition leader is saying that, and if the government is in this position, I think I better step back. So all she pointed out that there's a particular bank which is named in that document, which is offered to consider funding half of the operation for patriotic, and saying to patriotic, we don't think we'll do the whole thing, but we may want to consider. And while that is the sensitive position, you come out and create this mayhem. What is that banker likely to think? And secondly, she launched a tirade against Trafigura. And of course, suppose Trafigura takes the position that, look, you see Trinidad and Tobago, where we are being accused of XYZ, maybe we should give it a rest. Where does that leave patriotic? If Trafigura, their supply of crude and their supply of funding backs away from the deal. Doesn't this sound familiar? You remember Sandals? You remember the Sandals in Tobago? Where long before the government got to any point of negotiating terms and conditions with Sandals, simply identifying the Sandals brand as something that Tobago could use, that the opposition and their mouthpieces were doing the same thing that she did there on Monday night. And the next thing we knew, the Sandals family pulled out and said, we can do without you. They're now in Grenada, they're now in St. Vincent and everywhere else in the world except Tobago. And interestingly enough, those who drove that process congratulated themselves. And the very people who drove Sandals away turned around and accused the government of being incompetent because we didn't keep Sandals. The opposition leader on Monday night and in last night's news put this project in jeopardy because people who patriotic rely on to go forward in dealing and in committing itself to the government, banker and fuel supplier, are now the target of political attack in Trinidad and Tobago. So they didn't close it down politically by winning the election. They're attempting to close it down by making foolish attacks like this and violating all commercial principles. And telling me you found it in your mailbox, so you have to come and make yourself a rara over it. You think the former Prime Minister doesn't know that the state's entities engage in sensitive negotiations, and even though she's seeing it, whoever leaked the government's document to her, the company's document to her, a higher level of responsibility is to be expected from a former Prime Minister. Not to go on a platform and seek to undermine the process for your own personal benefit. And the benefit is because you couldn't issue a simple congratulatory two-liner. You had to thief it from somebody else. Get yourself in the editorial. Get yourself in all kinds of disgraceful conduct on the weekend and create this distraction, busting mark on Monday night. And of course, putting putting at risk all the work that we've done, because we are still hoping that by the deadline given, positions could change and we could find a way to get the intention of the patriotic OWTU company to take the responsibility of finding a crude oil supply, find whatever partners they find, as long as the partners are acceptable. And as I mentioned that, trying to pontificate on Trafigura, I'm sure if you look at the records of Petrotrin under the UNC, you will see that Trafigura was, I'm pretty sure if you look there, you'll see Trafigura conducting business with Petrotrin. And because Trafigura is one of the largest traders of fuel in the world, and I would be surprised if during its life as a fuel trader, Petrotrin didn't deal with Trafigura under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bissessa. But to come now and start to call them, accuse them of rape and pillage, is to say that, okay, they shouldn't work in Trinidad and Tobago. Many of the large companies who operate here have had issues outside, which didn't cover them in glory. So, we are not going to deal with crooks. And as a matter of fact, you know, I've made it quite clear that the only place that I knowingly associate with crooks is in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. Other than that, you know, the others have to be discovered. But I think this is a blow and a shot under the belly of the effort of Patriotic and OWTU to, on behalf of workers, break a mold and try to get involved in business. We from day one told the OWTU, any dealing with you on this refinery which you indicated an interest in has to be subject to rigorous examination. And such robust examination must be in the context of business. It's not union rara and it's not politics. And that has been our approach to deal with this matter. So, the whole question of asking the government to pay their fees, look at the verb in that sentence. It says, seeking to. They're seeking to get the government to do that. That's a big mark that she busts. They're asking the government to pay 26 million US that they spent on fees and costs and so on, and they're seeking to recover it. I don't know that they will find that. And in negotiations, you may very well give on one hand to get on the other hand, I don't know. But to come and tell the country that that's a big discovery from her mailbox, again, you know, taking you for fools. The sensitivity of this is such that we just have to wait and see what happens now. Because the opposition leader went as far as talking about discovering that there are grants and granting exemptions are part of the document. Since when granting exemptions is a matter to scare this country? There are very few businesses in this country that have not got some kind of exemption from the Minister of Finance, if that is what is required to foster and nurture the business, whether it is in tourism, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in importation, for whatever kinds of matters. So to come and say you're going to be a tongue crier over exemptions which have not come to the government, as far as I'm aware. I know of no exemptions at this stage. It may come as part of the negotiated position at the end of the negotiations. So why is the opposition leader, former Prime Minister, who should know this, behaving this way? And of course, you know, we have seen this kind of behavior before, without consequences. On this occasion, the consequences could be grave. Because if, as a result of this behavior, Patriotic lose their partners in any way and are not able to conclude as we expected that they might have been able to, and we do not get the refinery started, it will simply be a continuation of a refinery being closed down, like many others. Only this week, or last week, is it BP? Closed down one of the big refineries somewhere, and recently another one was closed down because in business of refining, if the refining doesn't make business sense, the owners tend to shut it in. And if maybe somebody else come later on and try to use it. So what is most surprising about this is that this Petrotrin issue, which they hope to have ridden on its back into a general election, I want to tell the opposition leader that the elections are over. The government of the country has been allowed to continue in office. And we should stop fighting that campaign, which is now history, and allow good sense to prevail and see whether, in fact, this very difficult assignment that the OWTU has taken on, whether it can come to pass, because it is not a chemistry set, as one person has said earlier on. A refinery is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise requiring serious capital outlay. It is because the government understood that why the Minister of Finance had granted a moratorium from the payment of the capital as offered, knowing that significant monies would have to be raised to restart the refinery. We understood that from the beginning. We analyzed the refinery for 2 years and came to a position that the refinery had to be shut down. Not Petrotrin had to be shut down. The refinery had to be shut down. And the rest of the business had to be restarted. Heritage, Paria, and we deal with the refinery quite separately. And finally, I want to say this. This discovery that Paria is going to be sold. What is Paria? Paria is the vehicle that we created during the restructuring to deal with the fuel supply into the country when there was no local production. In the event that local production commences at the refinery, what does that say for the vehicle that you are, in fact, using now? Can't you see a synergy between there? And why is it that you have to infer that there's something underhand about it? When she left office, there was no Paria. What was left was a Petrotrin cancer that was not diagnosed and not treated. We have had the surgery. The recuperation is taking place. And we hate to think that it is the intention of the opposition leader to restart this ailment for political benefit. I simply want to say to the country that this government which I lead, we have no skeletons in any cupboard. We are taking action in fixing the country's problems, and we are quite prepared to face the consequences of those actions as we did in the last general election. But we do so confident that the vast majority of people in Trinidad and Tobago are decent, right-thinking people who will see the benefit of what the government is trying to bring to them, and see the reasons for the actions that the government is taking, and see the options that the government is pursuing, and understanding that there are always other options, and one option was the option of the last government, which was to leave it just so. The Petrotrin problem was left just so, but there was a sell-by date. August 2019, the government had to find money to pay Petrotrin's debts. So we never had the option of leaving it just so, even if we wanted to. And thankfully, we have successfully restructured this company called Petrotrin. Its subsidiaries are doing well. There's one subsidiary, which is the refinery. And that if we find a taker on terms that are acceptable to the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago, represented by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, then we will make deal and business with such. If it is not available, well, then the refinery would remain there, because to operate it, don't forget, if we had tried to continue operating it, the best outcome of that operation was a loss of $2 billion a year. The restructuring, creating heritage, which has turned it around and is instead producing over $1 billion a year in profit. The government chose on behalf of the people to do the restructuring as against the leave it just so. And we will not be distracted or sidetracked by the irresponsible undermining conduct of a desperate and lost opposition leader, and an opposition that continues to embarrass Trinidad and Tobago. I would like to ask the Minister of Finance, before we take your questions, the Minister of Energy, to make his comments, and then the Minister of Finance will make his comments, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I just want to deal with one aspect of this issue. I just want the population in the country to know that the oil and gas business is an international industry. As Minister of Energy, I deal every day with international players. In Trinidad, as a matter of fact, this morning, I was in a GECF meeting, that is the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, which has been held in Algeria. On the panel with me was the Minister of Energy of Russia, the Minister of Energy of Qatar, the Minister of Energy of Nigeria. These are heavyweight players. And you will be surprised to know how respected Trinidad and Tobago's energy sector is. And the reason for that is that this country has an international reputation of honoring the sanctity of the contract. From Dr. Williams, to A.N. Robinson, to George Chambers, to Patrick Manning, to Basdev Pandey. Because we respect the sanctity of the contract, we respect with a great amount of fervor non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses and agreements in commercial contracts. Without that, you cannot succeed in this international energy sector. And what the opposition leader did is put a spear in the heart of these fundamental concepts. We can hurt badly as a nation in that regard. As a government, we have to bring some clarity to the situation and bring some sanity to the situation. But in the context of this business, what was done on Monday night by the leader of the opposition is a cardinal sin committed against the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The details, as the Prime Minister articulated, is well known. So all I would want to say is that aspect of it, which I wanted to put this whole discussion in context. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister of Energy. Could we have the Minister of Finance, Corporation, Seoul, please?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, my colleague, Minister of Energy, and members of the media, and the listening public. I want to clear up some issues because I've listened very intently to the Honourable Prime Minister, and I've watched the television coverage of the statements made by the Leader of the Opposition, and I've seen how it's been reported in the press. In September of 2019, September the 25th, in a document that is a public document that has been published since then, as Minister of Finances Corporation Seoul, I wrote a letter to Patriotic Energies and Technologies Company Limited. And it was with respect to the selection of Patriotic Energies as the preferred bidder for the sale, that's the first important word I would like you to remember, the word sale, for the sale, so that over a year ago, it was public knowledge that we had selected Patriotic Energies for the sale of the Guaracara Refining Company Limited. September 2019, it has been public knowledge in the public domain that the intention was to, if agreement could be reached, to sell Guaracara Refining and Paria Fuel Trading to Patriotic Energies. So the concept presented by the Leader of the Opposition that this is all suddenly coming out of the dark into the light, the idea that the refinery is being sold and the idea that Paria is being added to it is just nonsense. It's just untrue. I just want to make that point. The other point I want to make is that in this letter, we had told Patriotic that we are selecting them as the preferred bidder for the sale of the caption assets I've just described them to you, Guaracara and Paria, in the amount of $700 million. And we gave them conditions. We gave them 10 conditions. And I just want to point to another point made by the Honourable Prime Minister. The fifth condition fourth condition, sorry, a statement of any fiscal incentives or tax concessions required from the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So we told Patriotic over a year ago that you have to tell us what fiscal incentives or tax concessions you require. That is in the public domain now for a year. So they've told us. Okay? It doesn't mean that we will agree with what they ask. We simply told them we want full disclosure. If you want tax incentives or concessions, tell us, and then we will consider them. And that's all part of the process. The other one that I find shocking is the Leader of the Opposition's reference to Trafigura, and very negative references too, and insinuations. I mean, I saw the clip where the insinuation is clear that Trafigura is some sort of criminal enterprise that is involved in all kind of evil all over the world, and therefore not suitable for engagement in Trinidad and Tobago. But in this letter, in item, there's a reference here to Trafigura. There is an item related to a memorandum of understanding with Trafigura. It is item 7, and it reads as follows. We ask Patriotic to tell us, or to give us, a plan for the supply of petroleum products during the transition to full operationalization by Patriotic of the refinery, inclusive of the finalization of the memorandum of understanding with Trafigura Pte. Limited. So 1 year ago, it was known that Patriotic, in its tender, had indicated that it intended to enter into an MOU with Trafigura for the supply of petroleum, particularly crude oil. And Trafigura possibly, quite likely, helped them in the sale of refined products as well, because that's what Trafigura does. So 1 year ago, all of this was in the public domain by way of this letter written to them on the 25th of September 2019. So it's crazy for the opposition leader to come now and say the country never knew we were going to sell the refinery. The country never knew that Paria was involved, or certain elements of Paria, because the letter talks about certain assets of Guaracara and certain assets of Paria. And the lady has said, we never knew, we were never told. Not true. We were never told about Trafigura. Not true. We were never told about potential tax concessions. Not true. This has all been out there for 1 year. And the final item I'd like to deal with from my perspective at this time, the Leader of the Opposition also said, we can't sell it. The Prime Minister has indicated to you, they summarized what she said. We can't sell it because there's a mortgage. Nonsense. Obviously, if you're selling someone something, it must be free of encumbrances. If any of you, and I'm sure some of you have, are homeowners, would have entered into a purchase agreement to buy property, one of the most basic clauses in a purchase agreement is that the vendor, the person selling it, agrees that on completion of the sale, it will be free of encumbrances. We're not selling anything with any mortgage or lien on it. We will deal with that. That is a government matter. That's a matter for the cabinet, for the corporation sole. If there is a lien, we can get the lien put on other assets. We can get the lien changed to something else. That is a matter for corporation sole. It is a nonsense for the Leader of the Opposition to say that the refinery can't be sold because at this time there's a lien on some of the assets. I just want to make those points from a finance perspective. I want to go on to another topic now, because the opposition leader has a habit of making wild and scandalous allegations. I had to have a press conference just the other day to deal with some false and defamatory allegations made about Minister Young, and the Minister West was there to deal with defamatory allegations made about the Attorney General. But continuing in this reckless pathway, I read this in the papers today, that Pusat Besessa said on Monday, the IMF had indicated there was an issue with banks in the country, And in full dramatic style, she said, I am disturbed, and the people must be disturbed, exceedingly disturbed, not just about the deal, the sale of the refinery, but also the fact that the IMF has told us there's something going wrong with our banks, that the banks don't have the level of risk they should have. I call on the government to tell us, and if you don't tell us, this is the drama, I will reveal the report I have, a recent report, and she goes on, as if this is some secret backroom report. Nonsense. Let me put the facts into the public domain, and I'll explain why this is so dangerous. In the same way, the leader of the opposition's reckless remarks with respect to the sale of the refinery are dangerous. These comments are dangerous. Since 2017, myself and my team, who would travel to Washington, and in October, the team would travel without me because of the annual budget, but in April, I would from time to time take the opportunity to go to the annual meetings of the IMF World Bank in Washington. Since 2017, our Trinidad and Tobago team has been in discussions with the IMF to conduct something called a financial sector stability assessment. In other words, we have asked the IMF over the last 3 years to come to Trinidad and Tobago. This is what the IMF does, because apart from providing lending of the last resort to countries, the IMF also has a very strong technical department. So we asked the technical people at the IMF to come to Trinidad and Tobago and do a financial sector assessment, stability assessment for us. The acronym is FSAP. The IMF eventually agreed to do so in 2019, and they don't do this for every country, but we had been behind them for a couple of years. We wanted an independent analysis of a banking sector. So they did a scoping mission in June 2019, over a year ago, and the opposition leader would know this in June 2019. Then there were 2 main missions that came to Trinidad and Tobago, October to November 2019, January to February 2020. Again, the leader of the opposition, because the IMF takes its time to consult with the private sector, the opposition, various economists and so on when they come. So 3 missions to Trinidad and Tobago with respect to this matter. The team, the IMF team, did its research, it did its analysis, and it was reported by the central bank. The findings of the IMF, they were sent to me as Minister of Finance. I reviewed them. I got advice. I asked the central bank to look at it. I asked my technocrats in the Ministry of Finance to look at it. And I approved the publication of the FSAP report. And it was made known to the public at a webinar, a public webinar, on October the 1st, 2020, over a month ago. The report was also published by the IMF on its website in October and is on the central bank's website as we speak. That is the secret report that the leader of the opposition is talking about, that she will release if I don't say something about it. It's on the central bank website. It is the subject of a public webinar by the central bank over a month ago. And this is the recklessness I'm talking about. And you know what the main findings of the financial stability assessment team of the IMF were? Finding number 1, Trinidad and Tobago's financial system is sound, well capitalized. However, there are some vulnerabilities. You know what they are? The financial problems caused by COVID-19. That's one of the problems that Trinidad and Tobago has, like every other country in the world. So that the IMF just gave us some advice. Look at a few things. Look at the exposure of banks to the sovereign, because in Trinidad and Tobago, the government is the biggest borrower. Look at that. Make sure it's not outside the ratios and so on. Look at credit unions. There's nothing new about that. There have been reports that we should bring the credit unions under better supervision than they are now. And the cabinet already agreed last year that there will be an authority created by the Ministry of Finance to which credit unions will report. That is in progress. So there's absolutely nothing in this financial stability report of the IMF. It is public. It has been public for a month, and it is reckless of the opposition leader to say there is a problem with Trinidad and Tobago banks, and the IMF has warned us, and we're in trouble. It's all not true, ridiculous, and it is part and parcel of this campaign to destabilize Trinidad and Tobago. It's irresponsible, and I condemn it.
Prime Minister, just take one. I just want to put some numbers to what the Prime Minister alluded to with regards to traffic who are doing business in Trinidad in the past. Under the UNC administration from 2010 to 2015, PPGPL, which is Phoenix Park Gas Processors Limited, which is a state enterprise and a subsidiary of the NGC, did $177 million in business with Trafigura. US dollars. In the trade of LPG, propane, and butane throughout the Caribbean, in particular to Puerto Rico, over that 5-year period. Over $1.2 billion TT dollars, 177 million US, inter alia.
And I just want to say something to the national community. A lot of the conversation that comes from our political opponents seem to only get life, or can only have life, if it advises or portends damage and destruction for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Never anything positive. Never to support anything positive. A simple thing like Trinidad and Tobago being positioned, unlike any other country, to have the restart of T20 cricket and having a request to play a tournament here in Trinidad. That was the subject of opposition from the opposition, and all kind of thing was going to happen, and everything was wrong about it. Needless to say, the tournament was agreed to. The players came to the Hilton. The bubble was maintained, unlike the one in New Zealand right now. The bubble was maintained, and the tournament was played without a hitch. And our country and our venue, the Brian Lara Academy, was on display, and we were all happy in the end. We could not even get the opposition to support a cricket tournament. So we were not surprised that up to now, they can't see it to support something that the union, a union, for the first time, stepping out in the way, that if they successfully conclude this negotiation and take this $1 billion responsibility, will change the whole question of how unions behave in Trinidad and Tobago, because they will have a stake on the production side of the equation. You can't see that. So when we started out, the first time I addressed you from this platform about our response to COVID, I said to the country, we are being called upon to respond to a very dangerous development. And two things will happen. We have to examine our strengths and our weaknesses. We do have weaknesses that will work against us, and we have strengths that will work for us. And one of the things I told you then is that one of our main strengths was our banking system. Thankfully, it remains so. So the opposition leader, tongue crying about our banking system being in trouble and the IMF says so, is a lie that is meant to damage us, even as we identify our banks as our strength. Because when we were called upon to respond to COVID, one of the first things we did was to call the banking sector to duty. Our banking sector, Republic Bank, FCB, and Scotia Bank, they have external clientele. Banks are doing business every day on the matter of confidence. The currency of banking business is confidence. And the opposition leader's reckless behavior is threatening that confidence in the banking system of Trinidad and Tobago. And I can go further. The banks in this country are owned by the people of the country. Many of you don't know how much of it you own and what it does for you, because the shares at the banks that own, they have to pay for people who own the bank shares. You might have a unit trust account. You might have units. What does the unit trust invest in to give you your little kakada when they pay you? Whose shares do they invest in? Who is the shareholder in NEL, in FCB that has gone public as part of his shareholding? Who is the shareholder in the NIF that we've created to hold a substantial amount of bank shares? So when the reckless opposition leader awakens from her drunken stupor to come and tell you that we have banks in the country that are in fact in trouble, she hits at the core of every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago with her irresponsibility, and I'm asking her to stop. The politics didn't stop at the waterline because they went out supporting American foreign policy against Trinidad and Tobago. I'm asking her to stop undermining the interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We are not afraid of any political engagement. We are the PNM. So you can attack us politically every day. We're good for that. But when you attempt to undermine the country's position in these very difficult circumstances, in this very difficult period, that is not politics. That is simply undermining us. And the behavior of the opposition leader in the last turnaround is meant to undermine the effort of the government and the private sector, in this case Labour, in making what we are hoping is a far-reaching development. We trust that the negotiations can survive it, and we can come to an agreement. As I said before the election, on public platforms, if we can come to agreements, the deal will be done. If we cannot come to an agreement that is satisfactory, well, there's nothing to agree to sign off on. It's a contract that you're entering into, a $1 billion arrangement. Is not to be taken lightly. So all those who are looking around corner and seeing around corner and knowing that it was supposed to be a gimmick to entrap the opposition, the union leader, and to fool, I mean, entertain yourselves with that. But we have serious business to do, and we have been doing serious business. And it's because we have been doing serious business why we have restructured Petrotrin, and today can speak confidently about the success of that arrangement. If you have any questions, we'll take them now. Yes?
Prime Minister, the opposition leader stated reading of the non-disclosure agreement was not made under the cover of parliamentary privilege. Will the negotiations are currently taking place? Will the government consider any sort of legal recourse?
I don't think she broke any law. What she simply do is misconducted herself with respect to decency. I don't think any law was broken there. You have to understand that they have their elements all throughout the government, all throughout the country. So a confidential document like that, we expect it to fall in. I find it take long to fall in your hand. It took a long time to get there.
Prime Minister, you did say earlier that when Patriotic submitted its bid with the deadline, the government looked at it quickly, found the issues, and that's what initially led to the bid not being finding favor with the government. From a commercial standpoint, was it too quickly, that assessment?
You know, if the government had not responded, you'd have been asking me a different question today. Since you got that thing from Patriotic, why hasn't the government responded? This is a government that takes its job seriously. Government agencies were involved in the discussion, in the negotiation. All those points that are recorded in that document as their final submission to the government's team were points that would have been familiar to our team in the negotiation. So when they codify them in their position and say, this is what we are going to stand by, we didn't need 6 months to look at them to find out. Because we were trying to get them away from some of those positions. They stood their ground and said, this is what we are going to, this is the hill that we're going to die on. So we didn't need more than a weekend to look at it to see what they have submitted. and whether in fact what they have submitted is in fact acceptable to the government. It is because the government is in tune with it that the government could have so quickly have said, we have seen things here where if this is your final position, your final offer, it will be unacceptable to the government, because we know the field. We have evaluating teams involved. They report to a ministerial team that report to the cabinet or to the prime minister. So we are not lost in the woods. So the minute it came in response to the deadline, we could have responded by seeing what they had made their final position on. So that's what it was.
And also in terms of the, as this is a negotiation, at any point were there any major sort of changes in terms of what had been originally discussed when the announcement was made that they would gotten preferred bidding status?
I would like the Minister of Finance, Corporation, Seoul, to answer that question for the simple reason that I think your question has to do with her big point about 500 million versus 700 million. I simply want to make a point from my my basic training. If you are paying up front for something, do you expect to pay the same price as if you're paying a deferred payment 10 years later? I asked the Minister of Finance to, in a negotiation.
If you go on the net right now and Google net present value calculator, you will get a number of hits, thousands, and you'll see a number of online calculators, and you just put the numbers in. What we agreed with Patriotic in terms of our selection of them as a preferred bidder was that they would be, and I better read what we agreed so that there's no confusion as to what was agreed and what was not agreed. In Part B of the letter on page 2, that Patriotic be granted a 3-year moratorium on all payments of principal and interest towards the purchase of the refinery, and a further 10 years at a fair market rate, and that means an interest rate, to complete the payment of the US 700 million it has offered for the refinery. So if you do a net present value calculation, you would see for the first 3 years you're getting no payments. Then the 700 million is stretched out over a further 10 years. So you just plug that into the calculator and you will see that the net present value, if you make an upfront lump sum payment now, would be considerably less than $700 million. This is an annualized stream of payments. It's a series of semi-annual or annual payments over a 10-year period with 3 years grace in the beginning. So you bring that to a present value, today's value, and you will get a figure much less than 700 million. So that is no point at all. I mean, that is ABC, Economics 101, accounting, primary school.
So the question you have to ask yourself, Jewel, is whether the opposition leader is competent enough to understand what the Minister of Finance has just said, or whether she knows it and is deliberately attempting to play on what she believes is the ignorance of the population by misrepresenting a basic matter like that.
Also, in terms of, and just for clarification, in terms of the valuation of the refinery, the port, and so on, especially in the context of the depressed oil and gas prices due to COVID, was that a factor at all in terms of the valuation of the assets?
There's an offer and acceptance. Right now, there's no decision to vary from that. What all that is out there as a big thing is that there's a possibility that we could get an upfront lump sum cash payment. That's all. And I don't know if any of you ever watch lotteries in the United States where people win $300 million. When you look at it very closely, that $300 million is paid over 20 years. Go and check it out. And you will see, or they will take a upfront lump sum cash payment of $100 million US dollars. You understand? So that is the only thing on the table right now, and it's practical business common sense. If somebody wants to give you an upfront lump sum cash payment in replacement of an annual stream of payments over a 10-year period with a moratorium, fine. Do the maths. It works out. There's no science in that, no big deal in that. But that's all that is being spoken about at this point in time.
So, we can end on this note.
Also, could we get an update, just two things quickly, Prime Minister. One, an update in terms of the importation of the gasoline and diesel pricing arrangements going into, because the year is ending, we're going into 2021.
I think the Minister of Energy might be able to assist you with that.
Well, obviously, this is an exercise jointly conducted by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Energy. We have developed the pricing models, which we forwarded to the Ministry of Finance on Friday, and obviously both parties will meet, but rest assured that all the legislation and the pricing formula will be available to the public prior to its implementation on January 1st, 2021.
And you had made reference to U.S. policy earlier, as the government ensuring there are no issues in terms of once the refinery is up and running, any issues concerning U.S. policy, trade embargoes, Venezuela, that kind of thing.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't actually mention that. The opposition leader, in her haste to damage Trinidad and Tobago, went as far as to interpret from the document that she received, which has nothing like that in it, but she interpreted from it and injected into it some connection to the lies they told about Paria earlier and the case they tried to make against Trinidad and Tobago through Paria, saying that we were breaching U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. And this sale of the refinery, I saw one of her imps saying that the whole idea that is secretive is that the refinery will end up being owned by Venezuela. I want to say to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, all of these statements coming from the opposition are completely at variance with the truth and with facts. There's nothing whatsoever linking our operation and our negotiations here with anything to do with what they try to do. It is just throw it, hoping to stain our prospects. I will end by saying, Trinidad and Tobago remains a sovereign country, respectful of all, and under our stewardship, respected by all. U.S. foreign policy is one thing for the U.S., but Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy is not to be undermined by the opposition in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
That was